There are many people on their way, I think probably delayed by a combination of traffic and waking up late because of the Red Sox game. So, thanks. All right, so good morning. I'm Jennifer Aronson, Associate VP for Programs here at the Boston Foundation. I'm happy to extend a warm welcome to you all this morning. Many of you familiar with our work, but for those who are not, we were established in 1915. We're Greater Boston's community foundation. We're one of the largest and oldest community foundations in the country, and we play three roles in Greater Boston's social change ecosystem. We're a grant maker, we're a partner to donors, and we're a civic leader. And as part of our civic leadership work, we issue fresh research, we convene our community to have conversations on the most pressing and salient issues facing our community, such as the 2020 census. I've recently come to appreciate it's difficult to overstate the importance of the census. And today we'll have the chance to learn about both the tremendous challenges as well as the increasingly urgent opportunities that we face. Like many of you, the Boston Foundation relies on data to inform all of our work, and the majority of this data comes directly or indirectly from the census, or it's understood in the context of other census data. The census also impacts some of the main levers that we rely on as change makers. It's used to allocate nearly $700 billion in federal money, and about $16 billion of that annually comes to Massachusetts to support critical programs such as SNAP, Section 8, Head Start, and more. In addition, the census is used to redistribute legislative and congressional seats and to reset House districts. And although it's stated in the US Constitution that all residents, including non-citizens and undocumented immigrants, be counted every 10 years, the reality is the census is really an imperfect tool. And in fact, there are groups that many of us care deeply about in this room that have been historically undercounted, including children, communities of color, and immigrants. And now we're facing several additional factors that will make an accurate count even more challenging, including federal underfunding and a shift to bring the census online for the first time, which raises the potential for both operational and data security issues. And meanwhile, the terror that has felt traditionally by underfunded communities is only growing, including most recently, as you've likely heard, with the possibility that there'll be a question on the 2020 census on citizenship. While these issues are of great concern nationally, it turns out that here in Massachusetts, our population is especially hard to count. It is ever-changing, owing in large part to our many students, renters, and immigrant residents. The good news is that we do have a little bit of time to educate ourselves, time to educate our networks, and time to get involved. Because there is so much at stake, excuse me, what we do in the next 18 months will have a significant impact for the 10 years that follow. And because of that, the Boston Foundation is investing in the Massachusetts Census Equity Fund, which is working in a smart and sustained way in coordination with statewide and national efforts to help mitigate the challenges that we face. So we hope that this report and today's panel discussion help to empower everyone in the room and everyone watching via live stream to get involved to ensure a fair and accurate count for all Massachusetts residents in 2020. And with that, I'd like to invite my colleague Luc Schuster up. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Jen. This report's been a really neat one for us at Boston Indicators to work on. First of all, as public interest researchers, we rely on census data all the time to do our work. I see some colleagues in the room who do similar research in the public interest. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that more than half of the data we cite throughout the course of our work comes from various Census Bureau products. So we just could not do the work that we do without good census data. Obviously, more broadly, the census matters for all the reasons Jen stated. One way I like to think about it is to think of the census as a centerpiece of our democracy. It's how we know who we are as a nation, track how we're changing over time. Political representation depends on census counts. Federal funding streams, we'll talk about in a minute, rely on census counts to help ensure that the people who are intended to benefit from those programs really do see the support coming to them on their behalfs. So what I want to do in this presentation is first just a kind of primer on how the census works so that we all have a basic understanding in the ramp up to the census count beginning in 2020. Someone reminded me recently actually that it begins in April 2020, which is less than 18 months from today. So for the first time for me, Census 2020 is not feeling like it's out in the distant future, but it's really more on the immediate horizon for us. So we'll lay a quick foundation and then get into some of the details on what's at stake here in Massachusetts. Sound good? Good. And some of this, by the way, I'm going to do relatively quickly. Just want to flag that the report itself has a lot more of the underlying detail. So I hope folks will use the printed report as kind of a reference document as we're working on our organizing efforts in the coming months. Okay, so Census 101. Let's go back to the very beginning by looking at the original 1790 census. I'll just show you the final count and the 6 basic questions that were asked on the original census. You can see how focused the original census was on the question of slavery and counting how many people were slaves versus free whites. We know that political representation at the time reflected slaves as only being 3/5 of a person. So the very beginning of the census, it was all wrapped up in the political and social climate of the day. And that's been the case since today. So let's fast forward 230 years to the planned questions for the 2020 census. I'm going to show 3 screenshots next just because there's a few more questions that are being asked now. What I'm showing is the actual questions that were asked earlier this year in a trial run that was done in Providence County. The Census Bureau does a bunch of testing in the run-up to the decennial census to make sure its procedures are in place. One important thing to flag about the test run that happened earlier this year is that it did not include the proposed citizenship question. The census has a long history of rigorously vetting any revisions and any potential changes, and the citizenship question was added so late that it wasn't even included in this one detailed test run earlier this year. So, a head of household is responsible for filling out the questionnaire. There's a lot of detail on here that we can't go through together, but asking very basic questions. How many people live in the household? What's your age, your sex? 2 separate questions you see on the right-hand side, asking first about your Hispanic ethnicity or not, and then a race question where you have to answer what race you identify as. And then pretty similar questions for everybody else in the household. You can see at the very top of this, it says person 2. Similar set of questions asked of each person in the household. I want to flag a couple of revisions to questions for 2020 compared to what was asked in 2010. For the most part, they're planning to ask a very similar set of questions, but there's a modest revision to the race and ethnicity questions and a modest revision to the collection of same-sex household information. So first, let's focus on race and ethnicity. As you see here, again, it's 2 separate questions. And that can just lead to both some confusion in how to report numbers across race and ethnicity, but also just often doesn't reflect how people actually identify. So I'm going to show a really neat infographic that was part of a New York Times op-ed that for me was kind of an aha moment in terms of just visualizing how this information is collected. So this is data nationwide. Every dot represents 1 million people. And if you think sort of vertically, is the clustering based on whether someone says they're of Hispanic ethnicity or not. So that yellow column on the right-hand side is everybody nationwide who identified as of Hispanic ethnicity. And then the horizontal bands are the different race categories. So you can see, for instance, 197 million people identified as white, non-Hispanic, 37 million people identified as white and Hispanic. So you can see how this just gets a little confusing. But more specifically, look at the number of people who identify as Hispanic and some other race. 16 million people nationwide. This is people who don't identify as Hispanic and white, Hispanic and as Asian, Hispanic and black. And I think it's very likely that most of these people are signifying to us that they don't identify with any of these race categories and really just think of themselves as Hispanic. So the Census Bureau considered several different alternative approaches. This was the leading one here. Ultimately wasn't adopted, but I think it's pretty interesting. The idea was to combine all of the race ethnicity options in one question. So you could just select Hispanic and nothing else if you wanted. You still could select multiple if you wanted also. Also notice near the bottom there's a category for Middle Eastern or North African. Imagine today if you're of Moroccan descent living in the United States. What do you select as a Hispanic ethnicity or not? Are you white? Are you black? Are you Asian? Just the current categories don't really reflect all of the different identities people really have. So this was an attempt to get at that. Ultimately, what the Census Bureau is doing is a much more modest revision to these questions, keeping the two-part ethnicity question and then separately the race question. But what's new is the open response boxes below the race categories. So you can now select, say, black or African American, but then also write in under that if you are Jamaican, if you're Haitian, or if you think of yourself as African American. So we'll get a little bit better fine-grained information that way. Next, let's look just briefly at the collection of same-sex household information. Back in 2010, we could deduce how many same-sex households were in the country by identifying people who had the same sex, the head of household rather, and then the person two in the household if they identified the same sex, and checked a box that said unmarried partner. That was okay, but it meant in Massachusetts you could be a married gay couple and have no way to reflect that on the census form. So there's a modest revision here, which I've just circled the more detailed options below to identify your relationship with the head of household. And now we can say very directly you are a same-sex married couple or same-sex unmarried partner. The census will still not ask direct questions about gender identity or sexual orientation. So I think that's another area to consider revisions going forward, but we will have a teeny bit better information on same-sex households. And then also it's just really important to remember that the annual American Community Survey continues to supplement the decennial census with much better, more fine-grained socioeconomic information. So since 2005, the Census Bureau does a random sample of the whole country, asking a much longer set of questions. I've just given some examples of the types of information that this generates. You get information on educational attainment, country of birth, employment. This is what replaced what through 2000, had been the long form census. So through 2000, some respondents got a short form census and some a long form. This has just taken the place of the long form today. And it means every year we're generating this level of fine-grained information. Okay, let's now focus on what's at stake here locally for the 2020 census. And let's do that first by identifying which areas of the state are hardest to count. The researchers at the City University of New York have developed a useful measure for identifying hard-to-count census tracts. A census tract is a small neighborhood that's designated by the Census Bureau. The measure they use says that if less than 73% of the residents in a given tract respond to their initial census mailer, that tract is identified as hard to count. 1/4 of all tracts in Massachusetts are hard to count. Now this map doesn't quite look like 1/4, but obviously most of the sort of blank areas are more rural parts of the state. And you can see this really lights up with the urban areas in the state, a real cluster around Boston, and then concentrations throughout the gateway cities in Massachusetts. Our lower income, mid-sized cities tend to be higher immigrant populations, more people of color living in them. So I think this map is one way to think about where we ought to be targeting our organizing efforts as we ramp up to the count in 2020. Who are the types of people who are less likely to return their census forms? Let me walk through a few common categories. One is renters and people who move frequently. The Census Bureau begins the 2020 count by sending out a mailer to every household, and that's obviously complicated if people are moving frequently. People who live in group quarters, this includes college students living in dorms, people living in rehab facilities, assisted living facilities. People who live in non-family households with unrelated friends or roommates, there can just be understandable confusion about who's filling out the census form on behalf of whom. People who distrust the government, this is obviously of increasing concern in the current political climate. People who speak a less common language, low-income households and people who have lower educational attainment, and people who live in homes with non-standard addresses. This is particularly pressing in other parts of the country with very rural areas. There are some people with addresses that we just literally don't know where they are, and it means it's very hard to target them to do initial outreach. So now let's focus on Boston specifically and look at the picture for hard-to-count tracts within the city. Here we can see more than 400,000 residents of Boston live in hard-to-count tracts. The darkest red in Mattapan, Dorchester, parts of Roxbury are census tracts with mail return rates of below 60%. So I think, again, when we're sort of thinking about how to organize and where to strategize, these are the neighborhoods where our efforts are going to be most important for 2020. How does this compare to other U.S. cities? First, we did an analysis that just compared the share of Bostonians living in hard-to-count tracts with the 100 largest cities in the United States, and we actually have the 9th highest share of people living in hard-to-count tracts. I think that finding actually even understates the challenge here because the 100 largest cities includes a lot of cities that are just much smaller and very different from Boston. So we separately did an analysis just comparing us to 7 very similar cities that are similar in size, demographics, density. And here's that finding. Boston's actually the most hard to count among this subset of similar U.S. cities. Almost 2/3 of our residents live in hard-to-count tracts. Only New York and Philadelphia are even above 50%. So I think we should really view this graph as a call to action here locally. As important as getting out the count is everywhere nationwide, it's just especially important in a city like Boston where we have historically low response rates. What explains this difference? I think it's largely 2 things. We have a very high share of renters compared to these other cities, and also a very high share of people living in group quarters. 7% of our city lives in group quarters. A lot of that share is going to be students living in college dorms. We also have a relatively high share of folks who are low income, about 1/3 of our city living below 200% of poverty, and similarly about 1/3 of our city that's foreign-born. So this all kind of adds up to it helping explain why Boston's especially hard to count. So again, why does this ultimately matter? Well, one of the big reasons getting an accurate count matters is to ensure that federal funding to Massachusetts gets to the populations it's intended to serve. So we have a detailed section of the report which identifies the major federal programs that come to Massachusetts based on census counts. Oh, I should stress, it's not just the count of people that matters, but the types of people. A lot of these federal programs are designed to support the most vulnerable among us, and we need accurate demographic information to direct those dollars. I'm going to very quickly just run through some tables of the major federal programs that depend on census counts, which have dollar amounts coming to Massachusetts in particular. Healthcare funding, housing and transportation funding. Again, these are all in the detailed report in the lobby. Food and nutrition funding, social services funding, and education funding. We rely heavily in the report on actually 2 other research pieces that detail this very specifically. One is from George Washington University, a report called Counting for Dollars. And then recently, the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center did a great report called Why the Count Counts. And you can see the source note there, MB, is us citing that information. Nancy Wagman, the author of that report, is in the audience, and I actually thought I'd invite her to stand for a minute and just highlight a couple of these in particular to give us a more specific sense of what's at stake. Nancy?
Thanks, Luc. I call your attention to this listing right here, and as Jennifer said, there are a lot of ways in which the census affects federal funding coming to the state. And some of the ways I think of as sort of indirect. So for example, there's funding that comes to us that's directed to rural populations, and we use our census enumeration to determine which parts of Massachusetts are actually rural, and that's done by population density. There's other funding that is based on the state median income, and the census count, the population count, is part of how we calculate what our state median income is. But if you see up here, just if you look at this one in the middle, Title I grants, about $250 million comes to Massachusetts each year for Title I funding, which is funding that comes to local school districts to support reading support and other supports for low-income kids in our schools. Boston gets about $39 million each year in Title I dollars, and those dollars are allocated very explicitly based on census counts. What do? They look at the number of low-income kids, school-aged, between ages 5 and 17 in each school district. That comes from the census. So if you miscount, undercount your low-income young kids, not only will your kindergartens be surprised when you have more kids showing at the door than you anticipated 2 years from now, but you may also not get adequate federal funding to support the additional educational needs of those kids. So the census touches $16 billion worth of funding coming into Massachusetts each year, and some of it is very, very directly affected by head counts. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Appreciate it. Yeah. Great to have local research partners who are so on top of the specifics here. Let me end now just by highlighting some of the emerging national issues related to the 2020 count, because obviously these will affect us here in Massachusetts as well. So first, we've mentioned this, is the likely addition of a citizenship question. Really important to emphasize that this proposed question has not gone through the standard testing and vetting process that the Census Bureau usually undertakes. My understanding is that the proposed revisions I was talking about earlier to the race and ethnicity questions have been tested for years and years. Ultimately, they went with a very conservative, modest set of revisions. I just think that is in such stark contrast with the very last-minute decision to throw in this question with no testing at all. And what that's meant is that experts really worry that the question might depress the count, particularly among non-citizens. And when we say experts here, this isn't just generic experts. This includes many former directors of the Census Bureau itself. Ultimately, the question's being challenged in court. It needs to be settled relatively quickly because the Bureau needs to prep for a count that begins less than a year and a half from now. So we will just see where this lands. The potential addition of the citizenship question leads to some real privacy concerns. Federal law is very clear that the Census Bureau cannot share any personally identifiable information with any federal agencies at all. There's language that's very clear on this front. I just want to read this quote because I think it's really important. The Bureau pledges that it will never share a respondent's personal information with immigration enforcement agencies like ICE, law enforcement agencies like the FBI or the police, or allow it to be used to determine their eligibility for government benefits. So I think they're saying the right thing. The question on the ground is just, will the Census Bureau be able to convince the public that this is true? Additionally, 2020 is going to be the first online census. Just want to contrast a rough sketch of how the mailer went out in the sort of 2010 and earlier period with the plan for 2020 with it being online. So the prior approach was that a questionnaire would be mailed out to every household. They'd have a period of time to fill it out and mail that questionnaire back. If there was no response within a reasonable window of time, census workers would follow up either in person or on the phone to encourage a response. The new web-centric approach, you'll actually still get a mailer, but it won't be the full questionnaire. It will be giving you instructions for how to fill out the form online. You have a period to fill it out online. If you don't, you'll get another mailer with another reminder. Ultimately, if still no response, the same process as before, census workers will follow up in person or on the phone to encourage response. My understanding is that all of the census workers will actually have tablets or iPhones when they're coming to your door so that respondents who don't have internet access can fill out the form on the tablet in real time. So I think this probably makes sense. It obviously just increases the kind of degree of difficulty of pulling this off smoothly when you're doing this nationwide for the first time. And that really relates to the final set of points I want to make, which have to do with funding for the Census Bureau itself. It's hard to compare Census Bureau funding because it's so lumpy, right? You need a ramp up of resources as the decennial year comes up, but then funding can decline for the few years right after the census. So a good way to think about this is to compare the ramp up from years 6, 7, and 8 in a decennial period, which is roughly the set of years we've just gone through. So this looks at the funding ramp up for the Census Bureau leading to the 1990 census. So this looks at Census Bureau funding in 1986, 87, and 88. Similar shape ramping up to the 2000 census, a little bit lower for 2010, and look at how much lower the funding ramp up has been for 2020, well below the trajectory in the 3 prior censuses. So what this has meant is things like dramatically scaled back testing, many fewer end-to-end tests, and again, this is all happening in the context of moving the census online for the very first time. One other reason this matters a lot is that the mail response rates over the last several decades have declined dramatically. And as mail response rates go down, it takes more people power to encourage responses in person. So this graph's a little complicated. It's just going to compare the gold line is mail response rates, and the blue bars are inflation-adjusted costs per household of administering the census. And we see mail response rates going down from 1970 to today, the per household cost increasing significantly. The Government Accountability Office is projecting the per household cost of administering the 2020 census at over $100. So we've got all this new complexity, all these new challenges, and yet we're underfunding the census compared to this point in previous cycles. So that's my presentation. I just want to end by just highlighting a couple really key themes, because I think this is what we need to keep in mind locally here in Massachusetts, which is, one, we are harder to count than a lot of other areas in the country. Boston, but also urban centers across the state. And then that's happening in the context of declining federal funding for Census Bureau operations itself. So I just hope we view all of this together as a real local call to action to do really strong organizing in the next year or so that we're well equipped to get an accurate count in 2020. And I think with that, it's just a perfect transition to Alexi and the panel to talk about those efforts. So thanks a lot.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alexi Torres, and I am here both representing as Executive Director of Access Strategies Fund and as Chair of the Massachusetts Census Equity Fund. Briefly, Access Strategies Fund for over 20 years cares deeply about democracy, cares deeply about civic engagement, more than ever in these times where our democracy is so fragile and so fractured. We care about people of color in leadership and believe that women and people of color and all voices, but particularly those voices of those most affected across the Commonwealth, need to be heard and need to lead in our efforts to create sustainable change. I want to also welcome you on behalf of the Massachusetts Census Equity Fund. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. I won't get into too much detail, but if you're interested in learning more about us, both as a funder but also as a potential grantee of the fund, please stick around till the end of the presentation. But I would be remiss if I did not at least recognize the members of the steering committee of the Massachusetts Census Equity Fund, or the organizations. I will just say the Boston Foundation is an important member of the fund, as is the Miller Foundation, the Hyams Foundation, Episcopal City Mission. And we are also so fortunate to have the support of Philanthropy Massachusetts, formerly Associated Grantmakers, the Massachusetts Voter Table, and the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network. We bring together funders, grassroots organizations, elected officials from across the state, media, business, faith communities, and everyone and anyone, because we all matter and we are all so deeply necessary to ensuring a fair and accurate count in the 2020 census. So just by show of hands, just to get a sense of who's in the room, I'm interested in just, if you are here, for instance, representing academia or research, can you raise your hand? Okay, awesome. We've got a few. Anyone here representing media? Awesome, great, welcome, nice to have you. Members of the business community? Great, we are so happy that you're here and really, really need your minds at the table. Philanthropy, I know is in the room. Yay. Government? Excellent. Civic engagement groups, nonprofit, the nonprofit community. Lots of us wearing multiple hats. Folks in education, meaning like, yeah, not academia, but education. Awesome, awesome. So super important that we are all here, super important that we all understand that we all have a very particular role to play in ensuring a fair and accurate count. So what are we going to do today? We want to do a little bit of response and a little bit of digging deeper around the wonderful report that Luc and Peter and folks at Boston Indicators put together with the support of lots of us in the room. And so what we're going to do is we've invited 3 panelists. I'm going to introduce them one by one, but I want to just say that we have a representative here from the Census Bureau. We have a representative here from our Secretary of State, Galvin's office, and we have a representative here also from civic engagement groups across the Commonwealth. So I think we're pretty well covered, and we have all of you, and we're going to be looking to you for questions and more thoughts later on. So I'm going to start and with inviting up our first panelist, who is Jeff Behler. And Jeff, why don't you come up? Jeff is the director of the Census Bureau's New York regional office. And all of the bios are in your packets behind the agenda. But just to give you a sense, Jeff is responsible for the New York region, which includes Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Puerto Rico. And he is responsible for data collection, data dissemination, geographic operations. And we're lucky to have him. He's been a wonderful partner, and he has a long and deep career with the Census Bureau since 1997. So we're fortunate to have him, and we're going to start off each person just talking a little bit about from their particular perch. Jeff, from your perch as the Regional Census Bureau Director, share a little bit about how you're working to ensure a fair and accurate census in the Commonwealth.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I thank you for this invitation. I look forward to our conversation today. Before I jump into 2020, let me tell you what the Census Bureau does the other 9 years. A lot of people don't realize we're out there knocking on doors every day. And if we're not knocking on your door in a year ending in 0, then it must be some type of scam. That's not the case. In Massachusetts, we have over 150 field representatives who are out there knocking on doors every day collecting very important information. You hear about the unemployment rate that comes out the first Friday of every month. We collect that data for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who then releases the unemployment rate. Luc talked about the American Community Survey, which was the long form back in 2000. 1 out of every 6 households got it. Now we conduct that on a monthly basis. Housing starts, Consumer Price Index. We collect data for CDC. The point being here, we're always out there knocking on doors. There will be scams in 2020, I can guarantee it. There are every decade. Someone will put the word census at the top of a survey form and then at the bottom say, send in your check for $10 with your questionnaire, and people will do it. Part of our job is to educate the public on not only what the census is, but what it is not. We don't ask for Social Security numbers. We never ask for money. We don't ask for bank account information. So we look forward to working with our partners throughout the life cycle of the 2020 census to make sure people understand what the census is and what it is not. So what is a census? 4 easy steps. You can do this at home. First step, establish where to count. So throughout the decade, we're updating what we call our master address file. We start with a list of addresses we had from 2010. We get Postal Service updates throughout the decade. We do a great operation, which we work with the Secretary of State's office and other organizations, the Local Update of Census Addresses, or LUCA, again, to make sure we have the most complete and accurate address database so that when we get ready to start mailing out information, we're giving the opportunity for every household to receive a piece of that mail. Once we know where people live or could live, we need to motivate them to respond, and that's our partnership program. So we'll have a national media campaign, we'll have a national partnership program, but most importantly is our local partnership program. We'll be hiring 20 to 30, perhaps even more, partnership specialists throughout the state of Massachusetts, and their job is to work directly with our partners, to work directly with you, with the other nonprofits, churches, libraries, colleges and universities. 2 things we always ask. 1, help us recruit. We always talk about a census being a national event. In order to be successful, it has to be conducted at the local level, which means we have to hire locally. The second thing is help us educate the public on what the census is, why it's important. So once we motivate people to respond, then we'll count the population. And Luc mentioned this is the first time we'll have an online response. 4 ways you can be counted in 2020. First, online. Second, we'll have a toll-free number. All of our mailers will have a toll-free number on it. In the past, that was used to provide support or help, or maybe mail out a second questionnaire if one was needed. This time around, we'll actually be taking information over the phone. So for people who prefer to give their information over the phone rather than go online or fill out a paper form, they'll have that ability. Third way will be a paper form. We will do a targeted mailing once, later after Census Day. If we haven't received a response for a particular address, we will mail out a form. And then the fourth, as you mentioned, the most expensive thing that we do. In 2010, we hired over 500,000 people nationwide. We're anticipating about 350 to 400,000 this decade to go out there and knock on doors. We're talking about a 6 to 8 week operation. Hiring that many people, it's very costly. So the more people we can get to go online, the more people we can get to call the toll-free number, the more people we can get to fill out the paper form, the lower the cost will be, the less doors we have to knock on. And of course, we have to turn the population over to the president. Population counts by December 31st of 2020, and then the state redistricting data comes out by March 31st of 2021. So here's just a very high-level kind of upcoming events. Of course, we started our partnership program. We only have 16 partnership specialists on board right now. We're going to have close to 200 to 250 by June. So we're working with local partners right now to understand the challenges throughout the state of Massachusetts to make sure we're hiring people with the correct language skills, hiring partnership specialists with the correct cultural experience. That's extremely important, and we need your input on that. We started recruitment. And I'll talk a little about some of the jobs. Again, in order to be successful, it has to be local. We're opening up offices. I'll show you what the offices are here for the state of Massachusetts. Complete count committees. We're working at the state level, at city level, at lower levels, faith-based initiatives, schools, to start complete count committees with the focus on helping us to ensure we get the most complete and accurate count. Census Day, of course, April 1st. Non-response follow-up will begin in late March and early April, especially in those areas near colleges and universities. We want to make sure we get to those off-campus housing units where students live before they're done of their semesters. So these are the 6 offices we'll be opening up in the state of Massachusetts. And what's different from this census versus census past is that in the past, those offices were more public offices. These are not public offices. Because we have the technology, we don't need people coming in and out, turning in payrolls, handing in the questionnaires that they collected. Everything's going to be electronic. So it allows us to put more of that resources that we had rather than opening up an offices, get people in the field, let them work from their home. So we're excited about that. So I talk about 2 things that are extremely important. One are the jobs, and the second is educating the public. And I can't stress enough the importance of trusted voices. I would be happy to go out to speak to any and every community throughout the state of Massachusetts. I know my staff would be happy, but we both know it means more when it's coming from you, when it's coming from that local leader, that trusted voice. So part of our job is to educate, work with you to find who are those trusted voices in those communities that we consider hard to count, educate them on what the census is and what it's not, and then work with them on the messaging. So 2 things that are really important with the messaging. We're going to have a whole press kit, a toolkit of different types of messages, but we certainly understand that one size does not fit all. So we need your help in determining what is the best message, what will motivate that community to fill it out. And then once we determine what's the best message, what's the best vehicle to get that message to the community? Is it an in-language PSA on a local radio station? Is there a local neighborhood paper that we can put advertisement in? Is it a trusted voice at a community event? Is it a church pastor talking after a church service on the importance of filling out the form? And with the use of technology, it just really opens up the doors to a lot of different opportunities that we'll have for 2020. And we look forward to the conversation today. Last thing I want to mention is our data dissemination program, extremely important. One of the best things the Census Bureau did. We have staff at the Census Bureau throughout the nation. Their sole job is to teach the public how to access our data for free. A lot of private companies out there take our data, they package it up, and they sell it to people because they don't realize it's already out there. Our job is to teach you how to access it for free. Most popular workshop is grant writing workshop. We don't teach people how to write grant, we teach you how to find that very specific data. So this is a tool out there. I want to invite you, if you are interested, to let me know, and we'll get you signed up for that. I look forward to our conversation today, and again, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Jeff. Next up, we're going to hear from a representative of the Office of the Secretary of State, and to Susan Strate, Senior Program Manager of Population Estimates Program at UMass Donahue Institute, and a member of the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates Steering Committee. We have the same question, which is speak to us for 7 minutes on, for which you will be timed, on what we should know about what the Secretary of State is doing to ensure a fair and accurate count in Massachusetts.
Great. Thank you. And it's great to see so many people in this room today. I just want to say that. Thanks for coming. So it seems like that this is kind of like a Census 2020 kickoff, and in terms of getting the word out, it really is. But in the background, we've been working for the past several years to help prepare Massachusetts for a successful census. And I'm going to talk about some of the projects that we've been working on with the support of the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office. In non-census years, we work on population projections at the UMass Donahue Institute. Some researchers might have seen our work there. But our mission overall is, with support from the Massachusetts Secretary of the Commonwealth, our goal is to ensure that both the population estimates that are produced each and every year by the Census Bureau, as well as the decennial census counts, are as accurate as they can be for the Commonwealth. So during the non-census years, we work on collecting a number of data input pieces that we can feed into the population estimates branch of the U.S. Census Bureau. We collect annual data on group quarters populations around the state, including students living in dormitories, people living in nursing homes. We collect housing unit survey, data on new permits, on conversions. We also turn that over to the U.S. Census Bureau. And we collect birth and death data by county from our vital statistics here. So all of these feed into the U.S. Census Bureau to ensure more accurate estimates on an annual basis. But all of these annual estimates really depend or start with the decennial census base. So no matter how many students are living in a dormitory in 2016, the Census Bureau is always counting just the change from the last count up to the 2016 count and adding that into their estimates. So if those students are missed in 2010, there's no going back to fix that base. And so when we think about Census 2020 and why it's so important for Massachusetts, and Luc talked about this a lot, but I like to think of it in terms of data, money, and power for the state of Massachusetts. Data for accurate and effective planning. The decennial count sets the base for the next 10 years. And a lot of census products are going to refer back to that base, including the ACS, including the annual estimates. Money, $16 billion in federal funding leveraged to Massachusetts. And power, of course, the number of Massachusetts representatives that we get to send to Congress, and also the local representation around the state. And to remind people, Massachusetts did lose a seat in 2010. The power has been, over the years, shifting to the south and to the west of New England, and we would like to hang on to our power in the Northeast. So what we do to support accurate census counts every 10 years. Again, we've been working on this for a number of years, really starting in about 2016. Just a whole array of programs that we've been working on. I'm going to go through them one by one. We worked on the group quarters electronic review test, or electronic response test. Massachusetts was the only state to volunteer to be a guinea pig for this test at the US Census Bureau. We submitted 1,900 group quarters facilities, geocoded with contacts, to the US Census Bureau so that they could start to test out their ability to collect group quarters information from facility administrators electronically. Next big project, the Geographic Support Services Initiative. This was a huge undertaking. This allowed us to leverage resources already in Massachusetts, namely the MassGIS E911 master address database. We combined that with assessors' parcel data for Massachusetts and combined it again with de-identified voter lists from the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office. And in the end, we submitted over 2.8 residential addresses with lat-long coordinates to the Census Bureau. So that's the XY coordinates, so showing them where specifically spatially addresses are landing. So the Census Bureau continually receives new batches of addresses from the US Postal Service, but without any kind of geographic reference. So assigning coordinates makes sure that Census knows where to find these folks, but also that the counts are landing in the correct blocks. As a result, over 1 million new or corrected coordinates were used by the Census Bureau. We just got that feedback report about last week. Local update of census addresses. This is something that Jeff mentioned briefly. This was a huge undertaking. We spent about a year on this, a team of us. This was an opportunity to, again, take the Massachusetts addresses that we have through various resources around the state and to compare those against the Census Bureau's master address file. And anything that appeared to be missing or in the incorrect location, we could submit to the Census Bureau. This was a huge undertaking. It involved pretty much every city and town in Massachusetts. We worked on 14 regional workshops across the state and all parts of the state, 15 live screen webinar trainings. We put together starter address lists that every city or town could access, which had the geocoded information, which had the residential use in case they needed a list to do their comparison with, and then we trained them up on how to do that comparison. In addition, we acted as the insurance policy for the state, working together with a team at the Secretary's office. We conducted a statewide review, and we submitted over 100,000 addresses, possible misses by the Census Bureau. And in addition, Boston and Worcester also, we provided technical support, but they conducted their own reviews. So we expect the total number of ads to be much, much higher for Massachusetts. Do I have time? I'm at time? Oh, no. Can I talk about one more thing? Okay. Early non-response follow-up. This is a geospatial analysis we just conducted, speaking about why Boston is so hard to count, the number of students. And this addresses the students living off campus. We looked at bus routes all around the state, the location of dormitories, the location of colleges, and using ACS data, identified blocks where students are living actually off campus, and made a recommendation to the census. 2,800 blocks we recommended to the census for early non-response follow-up, letting them know, get to these blocks before the students leave for the summer. Then we're doing new construction, count review program, all along the same lines of helping the census to determine where exactly to count, what are the addresses that need to receive a form. These all feed into the master address file. But the next step then becomes, or goes into the hands of the complete count committees. Because once folks can receive a form, somebody still has to motivate them to actually fill it out. I wanted to talk a little bit about the foreign-born in Massachusetts. Just want to say that in Massachusetts, we've got a very high percent. We're ranked very high. Not only that, but the foreign-born in Massachusetts tend to be more recently arrived than in some of the other states with large foreign-born populations. And finally, the slide that I always like to show when thinking about the foreign-born in Massachusetts is the long-term history. This is a population which has a huge impact in Massachusetts. They are a driver of our economic engine. They always have been. We're actually today at about where we were in 1850 as percent of foreign-born in Massachusetts, and above the national average. So when we think about how the citizenship question specifically affects Massachusetts, it really does start to disfavor the states where the foreign-born, and especially recently foreign-born, are numerous in our population. Thanks for letting me run over.
Thank you, Susan. Actually, why don't you take a seat up here? And we're going to have time to dig in deeper on some of these questions, but I don't want us to miss an opportunity to hear from Beth Wang. Beth is the director of the Massachusetts Voter Table, and she's a longtime fighter for worker rights and racial justice and social justice. And she's going to speak to us a little bit about ensuring a fair and accurate count by including and making sure that civic engagement and grassroots groups are engaged. Beth?
Good morning. I wanted to get a sense of who's in the room. So if you can, please raise your hands if you or someone you know needs multilingual services, translation, and interpretation. And keep them up. So raise your hands if you or someone you know has children in Title I public schools. And then how many of you or your staff rely on our roads and public transportation to get to work every day? Okay, so we all have a story to tell about why the census matters to us. The Massachusetts Voter Table is a statewide coalition of grassroots organizations that uses civic engagement to build the power of the new American majority. And by the new American majority, I mean people of color, immigrants, low-income people, and young people, exactly the people who are often hard to count. The 2020 census is a critical opportunity for securing resources and representation for people too often pushed to the margins. In July 2017, the Mass Voter Table began convening a group of grassroots organizations along with advocates and allies to prepare for the 2020 census. And we knew that we were starting this work pretty early because the challenges for our communities being counted every 10 years are very vast. And so we know that we have new challenges in 2020. A new challenge is the politicization of the census. The citizenship question, unfortunately, is just the tip of the iceberg of a broader national climate of fear and distrust in government. Just imagine that it's April 2020. The presidential election is starting. It's heated. The rhetoric that criminalizes immigrants and the rhetoric about hacking and election security will become mapped right onto the census issues of the citizenship question and digital security. We know that that is a big problem. So the only way to cut through this noise is by lifting up trusted voices in communities. And so public officials, state and municipal governments, and funders must respond to these very unique challenges to the 2020 census by investing in community organizations. And so this is how we all can be part of the solution. So first, we all know these community organizations. We have familiarity with them, and grassroots organizations have built the credibility through their ongoing work of registering voters, as this volunteer from Neighbor to Neighbor did, I think back in 2014, knocking on doors to increase voter participation and holding workshops and events. That's really necessary to combating the climate of fear and distrust in government. People will open their doors to people wearing the t-shirt of someone who they've seen at transit stations and at their polling location and at their doors before. I have a sense that people are less likely to open their doors to someone wearing a black jacket with the seal of the federal government. Just a hunch. And so the second is that community organizations often have a map of multilingual services that people already go to. Moreover, they have relationships with congregations, with community health centers, with libraries, affordable legal service providers. People trust the people who help them fill out their immigration paperwork and their taxes every year. Often these organizations themselves are places where community members go for assistance, which is vital intelligence for an accurate count. In 2010, the Chinese Progressive Association made their own office into a census location where anyone could go to fill out those paper forms. It's almost like a polling location, but for participating in the census. Third, community leaders often have a very deep understanding of the unique local concerns. So as Luc was saying, we have a large number of renters, a large number of people living in these triple deckers. So local leaders have flagged that our local housing crisis, which has caused gentrification and displacement, has caused some families to double or even triple up. I mean, think of the immigrant families who put 4, 5, 6, or even more people into a one-bedroom apartment. That is true for so many immigrant families across the Commonwealth. And I'm also going to bet, and I have heard, that immigrant families are often afraid of reporting how many people live in their household. They also sometimes live in places that are not up to code, including garages, alleyways, and porches. People are afraid to report how many people live in their household to the federal government, and that's why we need trusted voices. I touched on this earlier, but these community organizations work in long-term coalitions, such as the voter table, but also Right to the City, as well as many other types of public health coalitions. And these coalitions can all see their stories represented in the census as well. And they can pivot their priorities towards an accurate and equitable count in 2020. And then finally, these organizations have the relationships to hire the right people. As Jeff was saying earlier, our trusted voices are necessary to make the federal census efforts effective. In 2000 and 2010, the Chelsea Collaborative even trained enumerators of the Federal Census Bureau, which is absolutely critical. So I wanted to share 3 efforts that the Mass Voter Table is leading to prepare for the 2020 census. So the first is we're holding local stakeholder meetings in gateway cities and communities of color in Boston. The first is happening in Lynn today, which Neighbor to Neighbor is convening. If you have members, affiliates, or even allies in gateway cities and communities of color, please reach out to us and we would love to invite you. The second is that we are piloting a Get Out the Count effort for the municipal elections in 2019, since we already will be coordinating statewide field. And then finally, if you have legislative priorities in 2019, we would love for you to add census funding for community-based organizations to your list of legislative priorities. So there are so many ways that we all see ourselves in the census. There are so many problems that we need to confront, and we all can take action and be part of the solution. I look forward to this conversation that we're about to have. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you to our panelists and for those introductory remarks. And we want to take a little bit of time now just to kind of engage in conversation, right? These are questions that I'm asking all of you. It doesn't have to be directed. And if you have a question or you'd like to kind of ask one of your co-panelists to dig a little bit deeper on something or clarify something, please feel free to also jump in. But I want to start us off with the 800-pound gorilla in the room, right? Which is, the issue of the citizenship question. And not so much just that question, but what that question is indicative of in terms of our current political climate. Because it does feel that we know that there are particular communities across the Commonwealth that are deeply vulnerable in this particular moment. And it feels like every single day there are comments and there are press conferences and statements that feel like an attempt to erase, discredit. You use the language that is most comfortable for you, particular communities, right? We're undocumented communities, immigrant communities, Islamic communities, LGBT communities, particularly, just yesterday, trans communities. So my question is, what specifically, understanding those very real challenges, understanding that this is happening within the context of a very real political climate during a very, clearly an important election year. What within your respective offices, we've got the Secretary of State, we've got the federal government, we've got the grassroots. What are you hearing, and what are you specifically thinking about doing to make sure that folks don't feel like there is an attempt at erasure, if I can use that term?
Sure.
Yeah,
I can kick it off. Earlier this year, over the summer, we were talking to members of the Boston Teachers Union. And these are people who have a sense of community, who feel, who understand their communities, understand the students who they teach. And I heard even from members of the Boston Teachers Union that they are afraid of reporting everyone in their household. So since there's so many mixed documentation households, there are many people who feel pretty okay reporting how many documented people live in their household, and are very afraid of reporting or saying that they have 6 people in their household instead of 5. And so I think what we are doing at the Mass Voter Table is starting these local stakeholder meetings, and the intention isn't to tell people what to do or give people a line, but rather to have an open and honest conversation about what the citizenship question means, along with the broader political context, hopefully to move people to action, to start holding community forums and events for the members of their base and for people in their communities, and to start talking to the public officials and elected representatives in their areas. So that is one place where everyone in this room actually can play an important role in starting to have the conversation with our communities early, to start getting the frequently asked questions, the concerns and the fears through open and honest conversations.
Yeah, and to kind of build off that, I mean, this is what the partnership program is about for 2020. We need to work with those local leaders, those trusted voices, to make sure that their community members understand everyone if you have 5 families living in that household, everyone needs to fill out the form. This is why it's so important for your community. And I think they're the best messengers to deliver that message. So regardless of the content of the questionnaire, we see it on our current surveys, the distrust in government. That's something we're going to have to battle. We know that. And through our partnership program, that's how we're going to kind of combat that. Working at the very granular levels, going into every neighborhood, meeting with their local community leaders to understand what their concerns are, and then ask them to work with us to determine what's the solution to that. And unless we work together, that will be the way we are successful with the 2020 census, is working together with those community leaders.
And I would say, as someone who cares deeply about making sure that we have an accurate census count for 2020 for Massachusetts, Massachusetts is one of a number of states posing a lawsuit against, against this question. So I'm interested to see where that ends up. I think maybe one community message is, to let these communities, which are very vulnerable, just to remind them that the Massachusetts delegation in Congress is so important, and the Massachusetts delegation is on their side, and by responding, this is a way that you can really kind of keep that representation at the national level. Further down the road, though, because the Census Bureau has to proceed as if this question is going to be on the form, I think the Census Bureau, and to put it on Jeff, but the marketing people further up have to be very clear about the message about how confidentiality is protected, and not just blanket statements, but really, what if, and what if this agency asks, what if that agency asks, and even down to what happens if I fill out 10 out of 11 questions, what will happen to me? Because colleagues in other parts of the U.S., also with large foreign-born populations, they're starting to get these questions like, is it true that I will get fined if I only answer 10 questions? Is it true that somebody would come to my door if I don't answer all the questions? So I think it's just going to evolve, I think, into a very detailed discussion that needs to happen, and the Bureau will have to have some very clear answers for the advocates, because the advocates have to believe in what they're telling to their community also.
And so, Jeff, just piggybacking on that, how do I ask this? So, do we have to answer every question on the census?
So, the Census Bureau will always ask for full and complete, accurate information. I mean, we're data geeks. We want, we do this once every 10 years. How can this data be used over the next 10 years for some really good purposes? So, we are moving forward, assuming it's going to be on the form, and we will ask everyone to complete their questionnaire in full. I can tell you the internet response allows you to skip a question and continue to move on, and submit your form at the end. In the past, people have chosen not to fill out certain questions, on their paper form. Typically, we have not gone back and knocked on their door to try and collect the rest of the information. So there's a threshold there. I don't know specifically what it is. It depends on how many people are in the household and how many questions they skip. But if someone did not complete every question on that form, it's not necessarily we would go and knock on their door.
Yeah. Thank you. And Susan, I'm just to this question and to the issue of access, which is really what we're, part of what we're talking about. Can you speak a little bit to the Secretary of State's office, particular plan, commitments around funding, as well as, I know at home, I just the other day sat down and actually went through, what Secretary Galvin sent on, all the 3 ballot questions, and, it's this important stuff. Right? It was provided to me in English. Tell me a little bit about the Secretary's plans around, language access and messaging and funding for the census.
The Secretary's office has already started conducting outreach to cities and towns, and the plan is once the cities and towns get through this, the November elections, because the municipal staff are really tied up in this, and I think we all agree that that's also a very important priority right now. Once they get through that, the plan is for the Secretary's office to meet with every city in the Commonwealth to talk about their complete count committees. And then for the towns, it will be more of a regional meetings, collections of towns together. They've already done some work meeting with a Council on Aging, thinking about how to work with senior centers across the state for the elderly population who's not comfortable perhaps filling out a form on the internet. So, talking about possibilities of setting up kind of response sites and response days with senior centers around the state. I know they recently, the Secretary's office recently completed a survey to Massachusetts school superintendents, requesting what kinds of interpreter services are used in that particular school district, so that the Secretary can feed that information over to New York Census Regional for operational purposes. So things have started up. Things will really kick into gear, I think, probably towards the middle or end of November. And as for the budget, it's yet to be decided. The Secretary puts in a request to the state legislature, and then it's really up to the state legislature to decide how much will be allocated for the census. So we certainly hope that anybody with a direct line in will support the Secretary's request, with the knowledge that this census is particularly challenging for all of the reasons that we've talked about. Census is always challenging. It's unusually challenging in 2020, and we really need to put all of the resources behind it that we can, because it does set the base for the next 10 years. So.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I want to underscore that, that support matters in lots of ways, but at the state level and at the level of the many municipalities and cities across the state, it matters that there is actual people and financial investment in this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what philanthropy is doing to invest, but I want to underscore, if you're here from a municipality, to reach out to us, because there are lots of ways that we can support one another in making sure, again, that we have a fair and accurate count. So the second, I think, big question on people's minds, and as we're going around and talking about this, is the fact that this is the first online census, right? So, unfortunately, as Americans, I think I can comfortably say that there is not a tremendous amount of confidence in when the federal government decides that it's going to roll out. We may have, I think, I won't. Without naming names, we have some experience with, some challenges around, things being rolled out online. And while it makes tremendous logical sense, we have obviously concerns not only on the side of the what's available and what's going to work or not work in terms of the federal government, but also in terms of our populations, right? Regardless of whether or not everyone still has a smartphone, we recognize that we still live in an age where there is a digital divide, where elderly populate. I mean, I have a 79-year-old mother. Like, I have no idea how she would even begin to consider filling out the census online. We have challenges of folks who are also in this age of Russian hacking, concerned about digital security, right? Is our data going to actually be safe? Are we, is the data going to be used for purposes to harm and to further exclude people? So lots of questions about online and online security. And so I'd love for each of you, again, from your particular purchase, to just speak a little bit to what you think, what you're doing and what you think we need to be doing in order to ensure, again, a fair and accurate count. Who wants to take that first?
I guess I'll go. So we're really excited.
You're a great sport, Jeff.
Yeah. We're really excited about the online opportunities this time around. So as Luc mentioned earlier, the 2018 census test, which happened to be in Providence County, which is part of the New York region. So we got to experience the online response, and it worked well. We didn't have any hiccups. People were able to go online and enter their information. Some of the things we learned were some of the partners are a little bit different. So we really reached out to a lot of colleges and universities, especially community colleges who have computer banks. They opened their doors to us to allow us, not only when it came time to fill out your census form, to go online, but they held recruiting events. So people within the community who didn't want to sit at home at their desktop or maybe didn't have internet connectivity could come to this recruiting center. We provided staff to help people fill out their application and get through the hiring process. So that's something we commit to doing again for 2020. So I think libraries, colleges and universities, any community organizations with computer resources are going to be extremely important. So we're really looking to partner with them to make locations that people feel comfortable, they feel safe. If they don't want to do it at home, they have the ability to do it somewhere in their communities.
Thank you.
And building off of what Jeff said, I think that community organizations that do have computers should be offering computer literacy classes now so that the right people have the skills to be effective enumerators and effective voices and doers in 2020. And I know that there are some organizations that do a phenomenal job of both organizing and providing services like computer literacy classes. Any organization that has ESL classes could potentially also be a site of computer literacy classes. Otherwise, I know that lots of working class people often have started using smartphones even before they had access to a laptop computer. We see that all the time at the mass voter table. I think as training people on how to use whatever is the smartphone application for the census is going to be critical to ensuring an accurate count. And then finally, lots of immigrants use different social media apps like WhatsApp and WeChat. I think getting on those types of what I call ethnic social media will be really, really important.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything, Susan?
No, I think these are great ideas, and I think as I mentioned, the Secretary has already started working with one subgroup of the many people who will need support, and I think it's really just at the beginning of stages of learning who those folks are and how to best help in each particular situation.
And what's really exciting about 2020 is you think of 2010 and our partners had these great events to talk about the census and really promote it and get everyone riled up, and then it was go home and sit by your mailbox and wait for that form to show up and fill it out. Well, now, if we have laptops or smartphones, we can take those to a site, have a big event to talk about the importance of the census, and let the people have the opportunity to sit down there and fill it out. I got to tell you about a great conversation I had with the mayor of Boston a couple years ago, and we talked about the ability to go online. And he said, Census Day is right around, April 1st. Wouldn't that be great if, like, between innings, Big Papi came on the screen and said, hey, everyone, take out your smartphone right now and fill out your census form. It's important to the city of Boston, and this is why. I mean, this technology opens up opportunities like that we're really excited about.
Yeah. So to that, is the technology going to be such that you actually can go on your smartphone? Will it be like an app, or would we need to go to a particular website to kind of?
You would go to the website, but it will be formatted for smartphones and for tablets.
Awesome.
Yeah,
awesome.
and it was in 2018 as well.
Great. Well, and just, out there in the audience, if you are, one of the conversations we've had is about, where are there computers? Where is there access to computers and tablets? Libraries are a natural, place. Where is there access to people who can be reminding us? And this is where the business community, I think, really, really comes out, right? Like, I get a little paper receipt every time I go to the bank. What if that paper receipt reminds your customers to fill out the census? Or, what if my receipt from Target reminds us, or let's think creatively about ways to have the link to the census, so that I can go on my phone and just click on that link, right? And let's think about creative ways to give people access to computers and support them in this work. So we're going to we want to take some time for questions from all of you, but I want to ask one last question of the audience, and it's this. So when I hear about, why should the census matter to folks who are frankly afraid, why, the message I hear is funding matters and representation matters. And I don't discount those. I think they're absolutely true. And I can tell you that communities that have been traditionally marginalized, underrepresented, and oppressed across this country, what they say back. They say, funding the promise of funding does not necessarily trickle down into our communities, one, or they don't feel it. I'm not saying it doesn't in some ways, but they don't feel it, they don't see it. And for us, representation doesn't always represent us, right? So if we're dealing with that reality, then what is the message? What can we say beyond that really will help people understand the importance of making sure that we are counted? Who wants to try
I'll
to
start
take
off with that one too.
Yeah.
So again, I don't want people to perceive that the Census Bureau has the right answer for every situation. We know we need your help to determine that answer. And that's what we're going to do. We have to work with partners at the very local level to determine, is there some type of program that receives that funding that maybe community members in that particular community use? Head Start, when you talked about emergency preparedness, or Medicaid, or SNAP, WIC, those kind of things. So I think it's having those very detailed discussions at low levels with local leaders in that community, and then work together to tailor the message and then determine the right vehicle to get that message to those community members.
Others?
And I agree with that. I think really this is the work that's ahead of us, right? I've talked about a lot of the work that we've completed, but this is the work that's ahead of us, and it's ahead of all of you here in this room, because it is going to be so specific to each community to understand what that incentive is for that particular community, and then to craft the message and build the trust around that message.
There are some phenomenal national resources about messaging from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, from NALEO, and from Color of Change, which are all being tested and piloted in communities of color. And otherwise, I totally agree with both of my fellow panelists have said, and we can test those messages in lots of different ways, whether that's through community workshops and forums, or through piloting those messages by knocking on doors in the municipal election in 2019. That's a critical way that we can understand how our messages are playing in the field, which will be necessary for us to make adjustments and shifts for the most effective messages in 2020.
Well, thank you for that. I think, we know for sure that for some, our civic duty as Americans resonates. And for some, that absolutely does not resonate. We know for some, the idea of the census as an act of resistance against erasure resonates. And so I think it's important for us to really speak openly about that, and to recognize that, and to speak to the messages that are going to really make this work for all of us. So I want to thank our panel, but I'm not going to let you off the hook yet, because I think we'd love to take some questions from the audience. And there are folks with microphones. Don't all come at me at once. I'm going to stand here so that I can have a better perch and see everyone. So I'm going to start on this side with Maria Elena, and then the lady in front of her would be second. So
thank you. It's based to have great.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. My name is Elena Letona, and I direct Neighbor to Neighbor. And I am an immigrant myself. I am a naturalized U.S. citizen. And though I totally understand everything that you've all explained intellectually, I cannot help but be who I am. So the question that I have is, I know that the citizenship question is there for political reasons. That is the only way for me to understand it. How will that information be used as it relates to the benefits of funding and power? How will that be used? How will that impact decisions that are around funding and representation?
We didn't say it was going to be an easy.
Yeah.
I think it might be helpful to also talk about and understand the background of adding this question, and I think Jeff might be able to talk about it a little bit more than me, but this is not something that the Census Bureau decided upon. This was, I think, the Department of Justice kind of put it upon them. Yeah, with Jeff Sessions. And it relates to, Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe you can help
So
me out
I-
here.
Yeah.
Getting into the,
Yeah, I
It ain't
can't,
pretty.
I can't really, unfortunately, address your question. I mean, that would really be better for the Commerce Department. They were the ones who made the decision to add this question to the 2020 census. We were asked for feedback prior to that being added, and the Census Bureau, it is public, on the concerns, some of the concerns that were raised about lower response rates and higher cost. But we have to move forward, assuming that's on there, and work with people like you to try and understand, what is it that we can say or do to help you, to help others, motivate them to fill out the census form, and why it's so important for the next 10 years, to complete that form. So I wish I could give you something better than that, but there is a responsive public affairs at doc.gov is the department at the Department of Commerce who will be able to address questions such as that.
sorry to put you on the spot.
Second,
Yeah, that's all right. No, it's get it
second
a lot.
question, and then the gentleman in the back would be third, please.
Thank you for being here and for answering these questions. According to Jacqueline Badalora, who wrote Birth of a White Nation, white has never been defined within the U.S. legal system. Is the U.S. Census using a definition, and how will that be communicated?
So I don't believe we have a definition for that. And again, this is a self-response. So we have a box there labeled white, and it's up to the individual to kind of determine what that, I guess, meaning would be. But we don't supply any definitions for any of the terms, and we follow the Office of Management and Budget, their kind of classifications for race. That's what we're using.
Yeah.
I would suggest it because a lot of the questions have to do with ethnicity. It's critical. And in fact, oh, thank you. I would suggest it's critical to define it,
Okay.
and it perhaps cannot be defined and should not be used. I think that's a vital question.
Okay.
Let me, okay. Well, go ahead. The gentleman in the back. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Michael Kozu. I'm with Project Right. We've been partners with the census for the past two census. But what you said to me today does not convince me to participate in this year's, in the 2020 census. When you look at our past results, when you look at Grove Hall, we're a hard-to-reach community. You look at our success rates in terms of bringing people into the census, it's unmatched. But what you have said today to me does not convince me to participate in the census. The reason why is the citizenship question, you still have not convinced me that it's going to be resolved. You say it's going to go through the courts. We all know how politicized the Supreme Court is now. So the Supreme Court is going to make a decision. It's not going to be based on a constitutional justice question. It's going to be based upon a politicized set of questions. Beth, I appreciate that you've been working with the BTU, and you got to tell folks, though, that it doesn't matter if you're documented or undocumented. My family is a clear example of what they were documented. My parents were born in this country. My older cousins were born in this country. Many of my relatives, many of the people were documented. They were scooped up, put into concentration camps behind barbed wire, behind armed guards in the middle of the desert for a couple of years at least, because of where my ancestors came from. And that was a political decision. It doesn't matter what you say that confidentiality means that the census cannot turn over this information. We see that there's a growing trend of bullying, intimidation, and threats being used instead of relying upon a fair and court. And we know how racial bias is within our court system. So right now, you have not convinced me, and right now, I'm still going to have to go on and say, based upon my family's experience, I don't think that you should answer the census. You have not convinced me at this point in time.
And thank you for your comments. I would ask, give us the opportunity to work with you over the next 18 months. Let us work with you to determine what is the right messaging. Let us, get more information and work directly with you to determine for your community, what is that information? And Susan mentioned it earlier, I certainly understand we're asking people to put themselves, their reputations on the line when they go out there and talk about the census, and we need to do a better job of providing them with talking points, going through, having these difficult discussions now, so that when the census rolls around, we're prepared and we have a great toolkit of messaging to use. So I hope that you'll provide us an opportunity to work with you.
Thank you. So next, let's go to this side of the room, the lady here, and then we'll take the lady here as the next person.
Hi, I'm Jessie Grogan with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. My question, of course, is around the citizenship question, as I suspect we're all most concerned about that. I saw your statement about not sharing information about that question with ICE or the FBI or anything like that. I think the real challenge is going to be convincing hard-to-reach populations that that's true, and that there's some real backing behind that regardless of the political pressure that you face. So I wonder what you're planning on doing to really help people feel comfortable that, although I certainly trust your intentions, you're going to be able to follow through even if you face pressure to share that information more than you would like to.
Yeah, we certainly understand that perception, and we have to work on stronger talking points, more granular talking points. I was at an event where the director mentioned, he talked about Title 13 and how the oath of confidentiality we all take, we're sworn for life. If we release any information, we could be fined up to $250,000, imprisoned for up to 5 years. But he said something that resonated with the audience. He talked about, I stood in a courtroom in Chicago where someone was challenging having access to our data and they lost. Title 13 has won every time it's been challenged in federal court.
Can you speak more to Title 13 for those who may not know?
Yeah, it's our confidentiality. It's the foundation of everything we do at the census. We collect very important information. And if we were to release information to any other agency at a household level, that would completely ruin our credibility. And again, it's the foundation of everything we do. We have to protect every piece of data that we collect. It's very important to us.
The lady here in the blue dress.
Hi, my name is Vicki Wyman. I just have 3 questions. I've done the census.
How about I give you
I've
one?
done the census 2000, and my question is, are you going to use the test? Are you going to have the community take that test to even be employed?
Yeah, so there is an assessment. It's being called assessment this time around. And again, you can apply online. You can do it from home. Before, we used to have to bring people into a community center. Now you can do it 2020census.gov/jobs. We'll make sure we get that information. It's live right now, so please share that with anyone who may be interested. We're not really publicizing it probably until January, only because our first big hiring event isn't till May. So I don't want people to think we're going to be hiring, before the holidays or right after the holidays. It's not till May. So you'll hear more about it in the media and the advertising in January. But it's live now. Apply once for the entire census for any position. And they're more situational type questions. They're not right-wrong questions, just to gauge, do you have the characteristics for a person needing to knock on a door? Because that's this job. You have to go and knock on a door and ask them for their time and, the questions that are on the census form. So there is a short assessment.
I've done it, but I'm just wondering about that test. Because the test that you give them for the employment has nothing to do with the actual job.
Yeah. So it's very different this time around than what it was in the past.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Back to this side of the room, this gentleman here, and then there was a lady.
I'm going to scooch over here because this is mainly for Jeff, and not fair that he be confronted without being able to see who he's talking to. No. Brad Kramer from One Family, and one quick observation and then one question. So the quick observation is I noticed that for the hiring projection, those numbers are dramatically lower than they were last time around and the time before that. So I realize that's nothing you can do about, but that's very troubling that the workforce for the census is going to be dramatically lower for the 2020 census. My question, though, is very different. The idea of working with trusted voices is obviously of critical importance at the community level. We also live in an era of celebrity when, for a lot of people, trusted voices are celebrities. So I'm wondering if there's plans to do PSAs with people like Big Papi, Alex Cora, Tom Brady, Ayanna Pressley, people who have, a prominence in Massachusetts and can be persuasive.
Yeah, and they are trusted voices to a lot of people. Yeah, I completely agree. So yes, absolutely, I know our national campaign will be reaching out to celebrities and things of that nature. Locally, if we have the right contacts to get us in touch with those organizations, absolutely, we would love that opportunity to reach out to see would they be willing to record a PSA that we can run on a local radio station, maybe an in-language PSA, depending on the community. So absolutely.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we don't have a direct line to Tom Brady
Yeah.
at the voter table. But speak to your question about the decrease in staffing, I think that's a critical place where community-based organizations can help fill the gap. We can't fill the gap of 100,000 people, but or in Massachusetts, probably even 100 or 200. But that is where the state of Massachusetts actually needs to respond to the decrease in staffing and the decrease in the number of regional offices by allocating funding to the Secretary of State to be able to allocate to community organizations in areas that are often undercounted.
Or participating in the Census Equity Fund, which I'll talk more about. Yes. The lady with the hat, please. Microphone is coming. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Beverly Williams, and I'm with the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization. However, I think that I'm talking more of a concerned citizen, because and I know that this is complicated, but there's a group of people that are not mentioned when we talk about the census. That's homeless people, that's incarcerated people, and returning citizens. And if we know that we have depressed reporting in communities where that is high, number one, to understand it, is there any cushion that, because it's depressed, is there something where we know because it's suppressed that we're getting more money anyway? And what do we do for people like returners and citizens who cannot report an address? So if you come out of jail and let's say that your parent lives in public housing, you cannot live in public housing with them. But how do we count those people? Because in certain communities, we know that there is a design to keep those people out of everything, including the census.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will mention we do have what we call group quarters operations, where we do counts in institutions, in hospital units, nursing homes, and part of the group quarters operations also includes we visit over a 3-day period all mobile food vans, shelters, and then we'll do, probably on the night of the 29th or 30th of March, we'll actually do a homeless count. So we'll work with community officials to learn where are those people who maybe who are not staying at shelters, maybe who aren't visiting those food kitchens or mobile food vans throughout the day. And then we'll go out there, we go out there with a team of individuals at midnight, and we'll actually go out and do a head count. But it's important to have those conversations well in advance to truly understand, where people who are experiencing homelessness, where they would be staying at night.
And I agree, this is a huge concern. At the last census, there were a number of families living in hotels because they were homeless. Thousands were missed at the last census. So this time around, Massachusetts, myself in my role in the FSCPE, I've really pushed the National Census Bureau to allow for statewide, a state-level research and submission of not only group quarters addresses and their coordinates and contact information, but also an attempt to locate service-based enumeration areas. So we'll be working on that at the UMass Donahue Institute. unfortunately, I've been pushing them for like a year and a half, and they haven't officially announced the program, so it looks like we'll have just a 6-month window to work on that. But group quarters are so critical for Massachusetts, and obviously this is a state that very much cares about its homeless population, and there is a good service network that we think we can reach into at the state level a little bit better than they can working from Suitland, Maryland headquarters. So we've asked for that opportunity, and we'll try to be pursuing that as best as we can.
Are incarcerated people counted in the census? Because I don't know.
They are, and we have, we collect and submit the list of again, geocoded facilities, prisons, correctional facilities, so they are definitely counted.
But in the neighborhood where the jail is, not where the people come from.
Exactly. It's in
That's
the,
a problem.
well, that's a huge, it's a huge topic. I don't know if you saw the Federal Register notice on it, but it was record-breaking, the number of comments that came back on that. I think what I heard from the Census Bureau's point of view is that they're counting people where they live most of the time. So that's their charge. So that's what they're doing. But it does have implications, of course, in other areas.
Beth?
And I just want to highlight how important Beverly's question is with 1 in 10 BPS students, which is a huge Title I school district, being homeless or housing insecure. I want to emphasize that with our regional housing crisis, that the ability to count people who have unstable housing is so important. And then finally, with hundreds of families coming to Massachusetts from Puerto Rico after the hurricane and settling in hotels, and with the FEMA vouchers running out, that is such an incredibly important question, which is why we need organizations that did the resettling of a lot of those families from Hurricane Maria who came to Massachusetts. We need those organizations involved. We need organizations like Rosie's Place, which might not see every person who comes through their doors on April 1st of 2020, but they have a better map of which service providers their folks go to. And so having those organizations that already have a map in mind of where people go is so important.
Other question. I'm just trying to get to a side of the room. You had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, I
And
just
then-
wonder if the Census Bureau, Susan Collings, and I'm just here as a concerned citizen. I'm wondering if the Census Bureau is prepared if the lawsuit goes forward and they lose it, or even if they win it, would you be prepared if nationwide there is a boycott of that question so that people that are both documented and undocumented just make it randomly known across the nation they shouldn't fill it out? And how would you respond to that?
Yeah, we're going to continue, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to continue to push for collecting every piece of data that's on the 2020 census form, whatever that is. I certainly understand the passion behind the comments, and we've heard that throughout the region and throughout the nation. We certainly understand. But our message is going to be, we're going to ask people to fill out the form in its entirety. That's what we're going to do. And we're going to work with them on what's the right messaging and who are the right vehicles to get that message across.
We have time for one more question. This person in the back there.
My name is Pat Courtney from Vine Street Community Center. I don't need it, it's too long. So my voice projects.
We're live streaming, so.
Oh, for live streaming, okay, now I
Please.
tone it down.
Thank you.
I'm from Vine Street Community Center. We're part of Boston Centers for Youth and Families located in Roxbury. Is there going to be a long form and a short form? Because it was in the 2010. And what it becomes the determination of which form will be used.
So back in Census 2000 was the last time we used the long form. So 1 out of every 6 households in Census 2000 got the long form, which really, the short form is the count, the long form is the characteristics of our nation. Luc mentioned back in 2005 we started the American Community Survey. So we're conducting that survey on a monthly basis. We will continue conducting it on a monthly basis even through the 2020 census. So there is a possibility that a household could get the short form, and then at that same month or the month before or month after, also get the American Community Survey. So that's going to be part of our messaging, letting everyone know that just because the census is here, we don't stop our data collection for all the other important surveys we do. We'll continue doing that through the life cycle of the 2020 census. That's a great question.
Great questions. So I'm sure you have lots more questions. I want to honor our time. We have 10 minutes, and so I just want to take an opportunity to wrap us up. What are ways, so when I first started this, you know, coming with my philanthropic hat, I thought the way I support the census is to figure out how to get money for the census. And I'm going to talk about the Massachusetts Census Equity Fund. But what I've learned in the process is that I can be, from my perch, and from all of our perches, we can also be advocates, right? I have, and my Access Strategies Fund has, and Massachusetts Census Equity Fund, and others have participated in providing testimony for the hearings on the Citizenship Question. We have supported and written to our elected officials around the issue of the lawsuit. You know, there are lots of ways that we can be advocating about all of these issues. Where are incarcerated people counted? That matters. And those are issues that we can be advocating about and talking about all the time, and don't require necessarily, you know, the actual census to happen. So I just want to really encourage us that we have multiple roles to play. With respect to the Massachusetts Census Equity Fund, I want to just quickly ask Katie to stand up. Katie is, she's mad at me now, but Katie, while I chair the Massachusetts Census Equity Fund, Katie actually directs all of our efforts in the Commonwealth for the fund. And she is ensuring, along with Jasmine Gomez, who's program director over at Access Strategies Fund, doing tremendous work to make sure that we're doing a few things. One, we have fundraised and are proud to say that we met right after a meeting right here at the Boston Foundation where we launched in February. Within a few weeks, we had already raised $1 million to grant for, in small grants to census, to folks who are interested in participating in getting out the count across the state. Right now, we are at 1,185,000, I think, to be exact. We're still working. That includes funds for small grants. An RFP will be launched in January. We'll be giving small grants likely in the spring so that you have a year. So if you are out there, if you are you know, a faith organization, if you are a nonprofit, if you are, you know, a civic engagement group, please be looking out for that and apply. If you are in philanthropy, and you understand and you continue and we've hopefully underscored the necessity, even with all the questions, for participation, right? Opting out, I think, it sadly doesn't work. It doesn't work for us as a democracy. So we may have to engage in the contradictions sometimes. We may have to engage in the messiness of it, but it's our voice in the contradictions and our voice in the messiness that matters. And so I want to encourage you, if you are in philanthropy, if you are interested in participating, you can participate in the Census Equity Fund in 3 ways. One, you can make a contribution and be part of a pooled fund where a team of brilliant people, including Myron Miller, who's here, and Maria Jobin Leeds, who's here, and Katie, and folks, Jeff from Philanthropy Massachusetts, and a group of us are coming together and we'll be making decisions about actually re-granting and making grants and mapping out those hard-to-reach areas and making sure we're reaching folks, trusted voices in those communities. So that's one way. 2, if you don't want to or can't participate in the collaborative fund, I encourage you to give within your own dockets, right? Create a special grants program or something similar where you are offering small grants to your own grantees. That's fine. 3rd is if you can't do that, at minimum, reach out to us so that we can get you information that you can share with your grantees. Each of your grantees, there's no reason why philanthropy across the state of Massachusetts cannot send an email, a message, a blast to each of their grantees to alert them and remind them how important the census is. So that's what you can do to participate in the Massachusetts Census Equity Fund. I want to close today's discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to say that, so two things that have come up for me in this discussion. One, messaging matters, right? But sadly, we are part of a society where we have sort of reduced messaging to what's going to make somebody feel good so that they can buy something. Right? Like what's, what kind of music do you play in the background, and what kind of words do you say, and what kind of sad images to make, to pull at heartstrings, or to make you feel like you're more beautiful, and, or you're more popular or whatever. Like that's what messaging has been reduced to, because we're consumers, and that's who we're messaged to. But we've got to think about census messaging in a different way. And so I want to encourage us to really, really think about what it is that we want to say, right? If I want to say, and I want to share that participation matters, right? And God, every few years I'm faced with the contradictions of my democracy, right? Talk to me about the Electoral College. Talk to me about money in politics and Citizens United. Talk to me about, the purging of voter files. Talk to me about lack of, fair representation of all people within our democracy. Like, we live in contradictions, but we cannot, I don't believe, give up on the processes that really underpin our democracy. So that's one thing. The second thing is that this is Civic Engagement 101. And honestly, this is the easy stuff, right? Because technically it's nonpartisan. I'm not going to say anything else about that. But civic engagement matters in the 9 years in between census, all the time. Funding for civic engagement matters. Leadership in civic engagement matters. So if this is the first time, because you're a library, because you're working with, populations experiencing homelessness or people in mass incarceration, or you're in philanthropy, and it's the first time because within your circles you don't talk about civic engagement, I want to encourage you to use this as an opportunity to really build up your civic engagement language, portfolio, training, because it matters. It matters now in our fragile democracy more than ever. So, thank you. Showing up matters. And we actually have a beautiful printed report that Luc and Peter and the folks at Boston Indicators worked on. It's available for you when you're leaving. I invite you to stay, have some coffee, chat some more. Thank you for your time.